Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. This is another in my series of sort of pulp adventure videos where I talk about various classics from the era of the pulp magazines and pulp fiction, but also adventure stories and various wonderful reprints done that are really doing incredible work to bring these classic tales back to some level of availability. And of these, I think the best and the sort of benchmark has been the incredible Sanctum books reprints, most famous for reprinting the entire run of original iconic landmark Doc Savage pulp novels, but even more so their reprints of the Shadow novels, where they were able to reprint almost the entire Shadow run of pulp novels, and the Shadow basically being the character that kickstarted the whole pulp adventure and superhero type idea. It basically started a whole industry, and this got basically fused and cherry picked and became the sort of comics industry that rose out of the pulp magazines, and very much took, borrowed, stole anything they could get their hands on from the pulp magazine characters, but also a lot of the brains and people behind the pulp magazines in terms of the writers and the publishers eventually started working in comics and also brought a lot of this material with them that they either reworked or reused. So there's a degree of that as well. But it's a particular part of American literature that is not often gone into, not properly discussed, not properly analyzed, and not properly appreciated for being such an important section of America's literary history. And it's, I think, the most underrepresented aspect of American literary history. What's also fantastic about the Sanctum books reprints is that they are filled with fantastic historical material and essays by various experts, a lot by the great Will Murray, which gives you fantastic context for the characters and the stories and the publishers and the people who made these stories and how the pulp publishing industry worked for the pulp magazines, and also various linkages to things that the pulp magazines, shall we say, heavily influenced, of course, comics most of all, and showing you tracing the trajectory and how this stuff actually seeped into pop culture. So if you go to a pulp era story, you're going to just be confronted by so much stuff that seems immediately familiar and so many echoes of things that you know and love that came later, that it's really crucial to have some of this historical context. And that's why the Sanctum reprints, I think, are so special. Unfortunately, Sanctum lost the rights for the Shadow, so they basically got 99% done and then had to stop, and then same with Doc Savage and such. So I think they're pretty much done in terms of the reprints, and unfortunately they've all gone out of print and they're drying up quickly. But before that point, Sanctum was able to also cover some of the other characters, particularly from Street and Smith, who was behind the Shadow and Doc Savage, and other fascinating characters, also the Avenger as well. But then they also ventured into other publications. They even did some reprints of the Spider in the same format, each book having two classic pulp novels in their entirety with original illustrations and artwork preserved, but also having fantastic new articles and articles about the historical context. So these are really treasures, and I strongly urge anyone interested in pulp magazine era fiction, particularly of the hero and adventure variety, to get any Sanctum books issues you can before they're all completely gone. But you do have to now go to the used market, and I've been trying to just grab whatever issues I could. But I wanted to talk today about their issue of Captain Fury, or also known as The Skipper, which was the actual title of the Captain Fury magazine stories. But here they have done a lovely single issue of two Captain Fury stories in the same sort of design as all their other reprints. So as always, these are beautifully done with original pulp artwork and contain 2 entire novels plus a wonderful article, an essay about the character and the character's influence and how the character was even created and the sort of goal they were going for. Because interestingly, Captain Fury is sort of a fusing of different Street and Smith characters, and you can see how the publishers were trying to go after specific markets. So Captain Fury is very much stemming from Doc Savage in terms of the mold of the character, but you've also got a nautical theme this time specifically because, of course, he's the captain of a ship, but also you've got elements of other characters. And interestingly, all of the major Captain Fury stories were written by Lawrence Donovan, who, as with all the writers, wrote under a pseudonym because all the books were ghostwritten, ostensibly by the same author every time. But Donovan was also the writer of the simultaneously done Whisperer series, which was another unfortunately short-lived but actually quite influential pulp character and pulp avenger. And so if you've ever read any of the Whisperer stories, which Sanctum did reprint all of in 7 wonderful volumes, you can actually, I think, start to recognize certain similarities in the writing. And also, like the Whisperer, the Captain Fury or Skipper stories have a little bit of a harder edge at times, which the essay, which is contained in between the 2 novels, actually covers a little bit and also suggests that maybe this is an example, like the Whisperer stories, of Street and Smith trying to get or cater to a slightly older, more adult age market, or try to convey some of that extra grittiness in them. So again, the rear has lovely artwork, but Sanctum always gave you a version of the original cover for each story. So you actually get both original wonderful pulp covers on the back with the actual Skipper title. And then at the top, they always have a blurb if they can. And this one is, of course, from Stan Lee, specifically talking about how much he loved reading Captain Fury stories. And you can also definitely get that because, of course, there are several famous Marvel elements that, you know, are directly stemming from this. You know, it's in the name that the main character is named Fury and has a basically floating fortress that is a secret floating fortress, and all you have to do is think of Nick Fury and the flying fortress ship and all the gadgetry at S.H.I.E.L.D.'s disposal. And if you read this volume of Captain Fury stories, it's right there. So obviously this was very much, you know, if not in the forefront of his mind, very much seeping out into the actual Marvel stories. So you can very much see the parallels. But also there are definite parallels to Doc Savage stories in terms of this being a lead character with who's, of course, very strong and heroic and almost superhuman levels, even though he's a normal guy, with a whole team of assistants. Here it's his crew who works on his ship, which again is filled with all kinds of gadgetry and amazing technology that was all developed by Captain Fury and his crew, and they basically go all over the world having adventures that are usually tied to seafaring or the nautical realm, because it's all stemming from ostensibly jobs that he's doing with his ship that's basically a floating fortress that has all of these incredible gadgets on it. And also there are many James Bond parallels, because Bond is rooted, like all adventure stories in a way, in the roots of adventure storytelling, which is exemplified by the pulp era. And so when you look at Captain Fury's ship, you can very much picture it being very much an influence on, say, Largo's Disco Volante and Thunderball, having the hideaway section that turns into a speeding hydrofoil, and that idea, that visual. So if you imagine that, combine that with elements of Nick Fury, and just imagine him being the captain of a ship, sort of with Doc Savage elements, and having a whole team and going around having amazing adventures with sort of a science and gadgetry background and a nautical theme. That's what the stories of the Skipper are like. This reprints The Red Heart Pearls, which is a story from 1936, and this is the opening, and you can see how Sanctum has beautifully reproduced all of the internal illustrations, All of the artwork is preserved. The only thing Sanctum does is they reset the type, and so it's nice and easy to read, but it keeps the original dual column style to replicate the experience of reading a pulp magazine. This story deals with Captain Fury looking for his lost brother and then discovering that his brother, who was also a ship's captain, had been murdered, and then going on a mission of vengeance. And this is the incredible panel for the moment where he finds his brother's corpse deep underwater in the wreckage of his ship. And of course, this being the 1930s, it's of course antiquated diving equipment in spite of the captain's gadgetry. So you very much get that vivid feeling of this being a 1930s pulp adventure. Then in between the two novels, we have the Will Murray essay I alluded to before, and Will Murray is one of the world's foremost pulp historians. So this is worth its weight in gold and gives you the whole context of the series, and also explains how, while it was a shorter-lived series, it was being done at the same time by the same writer as the Whisperer stories, which were also short-lived, but how each of the series did try to aim for an overall darker theme, and were sort of working off elements of Doc Savage and the Shadow and trying to sort of get a slightly different market in terms of the reader demographic they were going for. And then we go right into the second novel, The Black Daylight from 1937, and that's just a fantastic image to open with. This deals with Captain Fury going up against essentially a villain with an entire gang who has the ability to essentially black out all light from an entire city or even the entire country. So it becomes an epic story on gigantic scale. And then, it's how does one combat a gang of villains when you can't even see your own hand in front of your face? So it's one of the nice sort of plot conceits of a pulp novel that's also an interesting sort of predicament to try and overcome. Of course, we have plenty of nautical action because, again, this is Captain Fury and his entire seafaring team. So, of course, most of the action is still going to be somehow water-based. And this also has some fantastic pulpy moments in terms of just the vividness of the action. Another Bond sort of moment that, because anything in the world that I can tie to James Bond in my head will immediately go off. But if you love the moment in Octopussy where Bond manages to throw a guy into the tank with the octopus and it nice and vividly attaches to his face. And you always wondered, why can't we get more fight sequences with, aquarium tanks with deadly octopus in it? We need more of that. Well, Captain Fury has that for you, as we have here in this fight sequence. But my favorite moment in both of these that also makes you perhaps flash to the end of Fleming's Live and Let Die novel in terms of really putting the hero through it, or, a real predicament that seems almost like classic pirate type material in terms of dastardly things to do to your victims on the open seas. Well, this isn't keel hauling, but this is a wonderfully grisly method of torturing someone to death. But one of our heroes is captured by the villains and then tied by wire to a shark's fence. So then he is basically dragged to his death and also eaten by other sharks because he's also bleeding in the water. So it's basically keel hauling on steroids. And it's just ridiculously grisly. And that is by far the most striking moment that I found in both of these novels. But that is not all, because Sanctum also included a short adventure of a different character, but who was also a naval investigator, the character of Sheridan Doom. And so the fact that it's a naval investigator, that's how they could include it here to keep that nautical theme. But this is a really well-written, shorter pulp story from a character that actually lasted quite a bit. And also they make the connection because, of course, you have a character whose name is literally Doom. So they make the connection, obviously, to Doctor Doom from Fantastic Four. So you will find just innumerable little connections to all kinds of elements from comics when you start reading classical pulp fiction. And when pulp fans say that, comics stole most everything from the pulps, well, it's actually true. It's not hyperbole. It's legitimately true. And also, when the pulp started dying out, most of the brains behind the pulp stories were moving into the comics realm, so that also made that sort of natural progression. But again, most of comics were built off of lifting pulp elements wholesale, unfortunately. So this is a heck of a lot of fun, and also really important for Sanctum to have focused on a lesser known, less famous character to help rescue this character from obscurity. Unfortunately, they were only able to do this one volume, so this is one of the sort of outlier Sanctum printings of a different character outside of their reprints of the Shadow and Doc Savage, which most people know them for. But I think these other outlier volumes are just as important. They weren't, unfortunately, able to do all of the Captain Fury stories, but this is a great primer. And someday I'd like to look at the others, but unfortunately, since Sanctum is not really doing reprints anymore, this is the only volume. And you can still find this at a decent price. You just have to specifically be looking for it. But I just wanted to highlight it because it's such a great read, and it's a particular sort of riff, if you will, on elements of Doc Savage. So if you love Doc Savage, I think you'll have a blast with the Captain Fury stories. And also, I think it's fascinating to look at this because it was also written by the same author of the Whisperer stories, which are also fascinating and sort of a riff on the Avenger in the Shadow. So it's interesting to look at these shorter lived, different renderings and new characters that Street and Smith were trying to sort of expand their market share. And again, I think Will Murray is right to point out that these have a little bit of a grittier feel in places, so they kind of feel more geared towards a slightly older reading audience. So those are my thoughts on the Sanctum reprint of Captain Fury stories. Again, they only were able to do this one volume, but it's done in the same excellent style as their other reprints. You get 2 fantastic pulp novels, plus a great Will Murray historical essay, and the wonderful Sheridan Doom adventure in the back, which is just as good as the other 2 Captain Fury stories, but it's also more of a murder mystery, and he's a fascinating character himself. So all of these, you can actually envision the movie version in your head because the elements are so larger than life as you get in any classic pulp story. And I'm working my way towards hopefully one day being able to have a complete Sanctum reprint collection. I'm still way far off, but I'd love to be able to have all of the wonderful reprints they did someday. I have most of the Shadow and Doc Savage ones, and I've been trying to pick up the other sort of outlier volumes and just wanted to focus on the Captain Fury volume because it's just unfortunately not something a lot of people are going to be aware of, and I think the outlier Sanctum volumes are just as important as their Shadow and Doc Savage reprints. So as always, I hope my babbles about pulp adventure, classic pulp fiction, and the wonderful Sanctum books reprints have been at least somewhat fun and informative. Definitely check out the Sanctum reprints if you haven't looked at them before, or if you've just read their Shadow and Doc Savage volumes, definitely take a look at the other characters they were able to reprint. Even if they're a bit more obscure, like the Captain Fury stories, they are just as fascinating and full of pulpy fun and adventure, and also just as chock full of bits that were hugely influential, shall we say. So I think it's very fitting that they were able to find that Stan Lee quote and put it on the back, because it's very obvious and apparent reading these that these stories were actually quite a big influence on Stan Lee, just like the Shadow and Doc Savage stories were on the comics industry at large. And I just find it fascinating being able to dig into other characters where the publisher was trying different elements and sort of mixing things around to try and create something that was geared for a specific and slightly different reading audience. So you can recognize parallels to the more famous long-running series, but it's like just like in comics when you have a different sort of rendering that has unique elements, but it only lasted for a certain time. So as always, please do keep supporting independent reprint publishers. They need all the help they can get. And, I'd love if the Sanctum books could come back into print, or they could get licenses again, or finish reprinting entire runs of characters. But unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be happening, and it would be left to somebody else to sort of pick up where they left off. And hopefully that can happen with the Street and Smith characters at some point, because these works do need to be read and in print and discussed, and they are truly important as the most important publisher of what I think is the most underrated and underappreciated segment of all of American literature. I hate to recommend books that are out of print and getting expensive on the used market, but again, you can occasionally find Sanctum volumes for cheap, and I strongly encourage you to pick up whichever you can. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.